Excellent. Okay, good afternoon everybody. My name is Paul. I'm from Nationwide Training. I'm the lead trainer at Nationwide Training, and one of the areas that I specialise in is transport and chain of responsibility. Today I'm offering an information session to you all to be able to understand the basics around chain of responsibility. There are a number of units of competency that do actually encompass chain of responsibility, but this gives a base entry-level understanding of the laws and legislation around the requirements of CIR. The legislation in Western Australia sort of kicked on in 2015 to formalise what was initially a little bit of an informal process. Inspectors had a hard job in trying to negate the Act and the regulations correctly. By having this formal legislation of chain of responsibility, it allowed the government to give more power to the inspectors on the road to be able to define breaches, which we'll talk about, to have a look at three main areas, such as the load securing, the mass and the dimension breaches that are often occurring on the sides of the road. You can see there that the gazetting of this happened in April of 2015. It was actually passed in Parliament in 2012 in May, but in 2015 the Road Traffic Vehicles Act and the accompanying regulations, which covers things such as the mass, dimension and loading requirements, the Road Traffic Administration Act and regulations, which covers all of the administrative side of things, which I'll be discussing as we go through. And of course there are other regulations there, such as the authorisation to drive, to ensure that people that are driving the vehicles on our roads are actually licensed to drive the vehicles on the road, which is what police officers often look at for as well. The National Road Reform is a national body, encompasses bodies such as the National Transport Commission and other governing bodies that actually manage the not just the concept of chain of responsibility, but all things that are around chain of responsibility. Vehicle operators need to be mindful of their fatigue management. They need to be mindful of so many different things when they go out onto the road. And it really has gone way beyond now just being a driver or an operator's responsibility on the side of the road. All people or all responsible persons, we'll call them in the chain, if they have some influence on that load or loads going on the road, must ensure that they are actually following the regulations and actually making sure everything is safe before leaving that yard or leaving the destination or getting to the destination. The key objectives that comes from the overview of chain of responsibility really is to improve road safety. We have so many people out there on the road that are just car drivers, and I'm not saying that disrespectfully. They have no need or requirement to go to a heavier vehicle. So these people don't have a true understanding or a concept, I suppose, of the dangers of heavy vehicles. If heavy vehicle operators aren't performing their tasks to the best duty of care to all road users as well as themselves, then there is that risk that that innocent party could be actually facing death or serious injury from a result of a failed load or a failed vehicle for that matter. Reducing damage to infrastructure. So infrastructural damage is anything that is infrastructural: bridges, overpasses, roadways, signs, traffic lights. Anything that's impacted by a vehicle is an infrastructural damage, and that has to be the responsibility, as far as payment goes, to the responsible person that was involved or actually had created that incident in the first place. And I'll go into that in a bit more detail. Deterrence and enforcement. So this allows the inspectors now to have more power. In the old days, it was quite hard prior to 15 for an officer to talk about chain of responsibility. We all know it now. In the transport industry, COR, or chain of responsibility, when I'm a trainer and do my training sessions, I say, does everyone know about chain of responsibility? I think I could count 1 or 2% of my learners that sit there and go, no. 99% of my learners will go, yes, I've all heard of chain of responsibility. It's everyone's responsibility. So that's helping the inspectors to actually deter people from doing the wrong thing. And when it comes to enforcing, well, they're able to now apply those penalties based on black and white facts, not sort of ambiguous grey areas that sat in the legislation previously. For promoting a level playing field, it's quite simple. If you use any part of the road for transport, whether you're John Smith's Transport Service or Acme Transport Service, or you're a large corporation that actually runs a fleet of transport worldwide, and you are based in Australia as well, you all share the same responsibility. It's not one rule for one company and one rule for another. The rules are the rules. It's no different to when you go out the road and drive a vehicle. If you run a stop sign, you've broken the Road Traffic Act Administration Act for failing to stop at a stop sign as per the regulations and as per the Act. So it's very, very similar in that sort of area there. Improving business efficiency and compliance. Companies are becoming very savvy, especially when they're doing particular freight profiles, things like large steel coils or moving large haul pack tyres for the mining industry. They're developing their trailers now so that the actual heights of the trailer aren't creating a problem for over height. So they're having lower level trailers with scalloped bases in the trailer that also acts as part of a cradling system for those devices, or they'll actually have formwork cradles built onto the truck that allows that object to be craned in and quite simply restrained, because most of the restraining is already done in that engineered cradle. Why do we have it? Well, without having a law, without having some form of official legislation, people will just do what they want to do. I've always used the analogy, be proactive, don't be reactive. If you are proactive and your business is running effectively and efficiently, you should have systems and processes in place, especially when using other third parties as a transporter for your company or as part of a transporter for your company. You need to make sure that everyone sings from the same book. We're not singing out of tune, and by having all of these compliance processes in place, we are then ensuring that we're avoiding those breaches that we don't want to have, because the breaches can accumulate and get quite high depending on the severity of the penalties. The people that you see there are the people in the chain of responsibility. We're no longer just talking about drivers or operators. Drivers still have a very big role to play. You should not be a heavy vehicle operator unless you've had appropriate training to know about your load restraining and security, about the mass and the dimensions of your vehicle and the maximum dimensions that your vehicle cannot go beyond without permits. But consignors also need to provide that information that is accurate, not just this is a load I want picked up to go to. It has to be this is the load, its weight and characteristics are X, it needs to go to this destination, so that may require the company to look at doing further things other than just selecting the right vehicle, but have appropriate communications, having appropriate journey management plans or any other documentation that might be required for the driver to safely get there, and also ensure by giving all that information the person that's loading that vehicle should also have access to the right equipment. And that's part of the issue that's lacked for many years. Loaders themselves, they load the vehicle, and if they're trained in load restraint, they can often be the ones restraining those loads as well. Packers are the ones that are organising the goods to be loaded, so therefore accurate documentation, weights, dimensions, those type of things, as they're making up pallets or other goods that are going onto a vehicle, are being calculated so that it can be all put onto documentation such as a consignment note or a manifest for the driver. So when the driver gets that manifest or consignment note, they know exactly what they've been had loaded on their vehicle. They can make the determination if they need to add more load restraint, or if they need to change the load restraint, or if they need to move the load, as the load may be not quite positioned to the axle grouping, for example. The operators, they're the ones that generally are the owner of the vehicle or prime contractors, the owner of the business type orientated people. They need to ensure that the vehicles and equipment are serviceable, in good condition, that have all the appropriate equipment, that all of the training, supervision and instruction has been done for the drivers, loaders, packers. And then you have your freight handlers as well, so they can often be those that actually unload vehicles or unload containers or load containers. So with containers, we need to have what is known as a container weight declaration, CWD. And that container weight declaration is something that has to be now accompanying the driver, either digitally or in hard copy, to outline the weight of the goods, what the goods are, the date of declaration, and where those goods are actually being consigned from and to. The laws apply to not just heavy vehicle Now, under the Eastern States ruling, under Heavy Vehicle National Law, or as everyone likes to abbreviate things in Australia, HVNL. HVNL is the Heavy Vehicle National Law. They only apply chain of responsibility legislation to vehicles that are 4.5 tonne or above. In WA, all vehicles, and that includes light vehicles and in fact motorcycles as well, that are used to carry cargo, right up to road trains, would have to be also understanding that they're load securing, their mass and their dimensions are not in a way of such that's going to create instability of that vehicle or going to cause any infrastructural damage or any serious harm to people. So all of those people in the chain in WA are covered. So it's not just a heavy vehicle law, it's an entire law for all vehicle operation. The extension to this also goes to body corporates, so any body corporate that actually manages or owns the company, partners or unincorporated associations, people that have a vested interest in a business. They may not directly be part of that business, but they have some vested interest in that business. They still come under the chain of responsibility if something was to go wrong, if there was any inaction. Now, action is what we want, not inaction. The employers, which are now called PCBUs, you may or may not be aware, but WA is now under work health safety legislation. We no longer come under OH&S, or Occupational Health and Safety. Terminology has shifted quite a bit. An employer, as such, in the old OH&S legislation, was designed for more so to say that that is my employer, but contractors aren't employed by that company a lot of the time. They're self-employed. So if they come onto a site, they are still needing to have the same level of duty of care for themselves as what all the other employees, so to speak, which we now call workers, get on their site. So a PCBU, or a person conducting a business or undertaking, has a legal duty of care, as far as practicable, to still provide and maintain a safe working environment, safe plant and equipment, training, supervision, instruction and information, ensure that there's safe systems of work, there are adequate facilities, that the health of workers is monitored, and that's done through driver fitness medicals and those type of things. That hasn't changed. The employee, as we always call ourselves, is now classified as a worker, and workers are covered for anybody on the site, including volunteers that actually go onto a work site. So it's not just a limitation of one body anymore. It's any person in that entire body or chain that can actually be infringed, if it was to go to court especially, that forms part of that issue through chain of responsibility. The key components to COR, or chain of responsibility, really is to have some legal accountability. It's like anything in life. You have to be held accountable for your actions. If you don't do something, or you know you're willingly not doing something, and it's completely breaching the law, you need to be held accountable for that. And that's why we have a set of laws that unfortunately carry penalties, and those penalties can vary from infringements and fines right through to court-imposed penalties, depending on the severity. If someone was to lose their life as a result of this, we're not only dealing with the main roads law here, we're dealing with work health and safety law as well, because we are failing our duty of care to all people involved, including the worker and everyone around them, if that person is to be seriously injured or, worst case, killed. That's a family member gone. We have a risk categorisation, which I'll talk about, and that's probably easier if I explain that when we get there. There are expanded powers now, so these powers of expandment are allowing not so much the roadside inspectors, but dedicated investigators and inspectors for main roads to actually go to premises now and ask for documentation, to ask for computer files, for hard drives, those sort of things, to be able to build a case if they know that there has been a breach in the chain of responsibility. The evidence is paramount. They need that evidence if they want to take this to court. The increased legal offences now, obviously that gives that more power for main roads with this black and white legislation, allows them to have more power to be able to enact the chain of responsibility. And it also has the introduction, as I may have mentioned earlier, of the container weight declaration, as people abbreviate this to CWD, for container weight declaration. The container weight declaration, there's no real specific format for this. They do state in the regulation that it can be a document that is transmitted electronically, or it may be in a hard copy. Either way, the document must contain the following. It's got to have the weight of the freight container and the contents. It's got to have a date of the declaration. It's got to have the number and other particulars that are in that container. There has to be some name of the responsible person that's receiving that container. The only time this would vary or change, and that's been the case for any freight of this particular profile I'm about to talk about, is dangerous goods. Dangerous goods, regardless of whether it's going into a freight container or any vehicle, must have a hard copy transport document which outlines all of the relevant information from the UN code, the Australian Dangerous Goods Code, that is required for that driver to know exactly what they're carrying, and for the emergency services, should an event occur, to know exactly what is in or on that vehicle. The breach categories, as I mentioned to you, fall into a similar categorisation as a risk matrix. If you think about a basic risk matrix, low, medium, high, minor, substantial, severe, low, medium, catastrophic, whichever way you look at it, they have gone on a path of minor, substantial and severe. There's a line in the sand here that if the breach is deemed as a minor breach, that is something that's not threatening public life or public safety, but it's seen as being an unrecovered possible road wear due to an overweight vehicle, for example, or it could be just purely and fairly an unfair business advantage. Why should you be allowed to cheat when the other bigger companies out there are doing everything by the book and creating all of these processes and policies and procedures, and you're doing it the wrong way? Substantial and appreciable risk to infrastructure. So we're worrying more about the infrastructural damage that may occur at this point and an unfair business advantage. Well, severe is an appreciable risk to public safety. The second you start hearing human life come into something, we're getting into that severe category or high risk category. If you've ever done a risk assessment before, you would understand that there is a matrix principle similar to this, that you actually look at what's the likelihood of this consequence or risk occurring, what's the consequence or outcome of that exposure to that hazard which becomes a risk, and then you have to categorise that in some form or another. The way the inspectors look at this is there are three areas that they're chasing for general freight, and those three areas are mass, for example. The amount of mass in something is the amount of weight. So I'll give you a simple scenario. If you think about a heavy rigid truck has a single axle at the front and it has two tyres that do the turning on the vehicle. That has an approximate mass allowability of 6 tonne on what we call the steers. The back axles, there are two of those, they're called a tandem axle. There's 4 tyres per that axle group. That allows up to 16.5 tonne. Simple maths here, if you add 16.5 and 6 together, you come up with 22.5. The gross vehicle mass of a vehicle is the amount of mass that vehicle is allowed to be when loaded. So 22.5 tonne GVM, or gross vehicle mass, is the maximum it can go to. We have to factor in what is called payload. Now, payload is the amount of weight you can physically put onto a vehicle. Again, if I use a simple analogy of a heavy rigid truck, most heavy rigid trucks, and I'm talking base standard heavy rigid trucks here that are manufactured at around the 8 tonne, 8,000 kilograms. That's tear weight. That's the unloaded weight of the vehicle. So if the truck weighs 8 tonne and it's not allowed to exceed 22.5 tonne, then logically that means that our payload cannot exceed 14.5 tonne. That means that whatever we put on that vehicle, including ourselves, any other equipment, load restraint equipment, loads, etc., forms part of that payload. And in saying that, that also encompasses part of the fuel, because when they manufacture vehicles, they only account for 20% of fuel volume in the tank, not the full tank. So that's something a lot of people need to be aware of. Here's a scenario for you. A minor breach for mass might state that less than 105% of the maximum mass of that vehicle. You've got a 22.5 tonne truck, you overload that by 900 kilograms, you are sitting at 4% over the maximum permitted mass. That is a minor breach. If you have a vehicle that has a GVM of 22.5 tonne, and let's say, for example, you've loaded that vehicle by 19%, because it's saying here equal or greater than 105, but less than 120, so you've gone to 19% over, you're essentially looking at 4.2 tonne over the maximum permitted mass. If we're going above 20%, equal or greater than 20% over the maximum mass, and that would be 4.5 tonne, for example, that's a severe breach. So the inspectors will weigh the vehicle. They use a scale called a Henny scale, and they will determine by that axle grouping whether that vehicle is or is not within the maximum permitted weight as per the regulations. We have to think logics here. If a vehicle is overloaded, it is not going to perform the same way as when loaded to the maximum engineered capacity. For those of us that have heard the term hierarchy of control, one of the keys in hierarchy of control is engineering controls. If a vehicle has been engineered to a specific specification, and in this case weight, you can't exceed that weight. It's no different to a forklift. If you overload the forklift beyond the load capacity plate or data plate, you run the risk of not only tipping that machine over, but you also run the risk of breaking things such as chains and hydraulic lines and those sort of things that will fail. Well, in the case of a truck, it's not going to stop as well, if at all. It's not going to be able to perform and steer as well as if it was loaded correctly. And you may even destroy suspension, brake lines, tyres, who knows what can go wrong depending on the amount of weight you've gone over. The ones below there are dimensional breaches. Now, the length of a vehicle is depending on the vehicle. So again, if I use a basic heavy rigid, a heavy rigid truck, including its load, cannot go over 12.5 metres. That's it. Doesn't matter what overhang you have, that truck cannot go over 12.5 metres. Full stop. A semi-trailer, including load, cannot go over 19 metres. Now, we then have to start considering that we've got, beyond semi-trailers, we've got B-doubles, we've got pocket road trains, we've got triples, we've got quads. So when you start going up to these sort of dimensions, you need to check the regulations. Now, up north, they are allowing in some areas on gazetted roads up to 60 metres now for quads, same as in the northern part of Queensland. But that's only on gazetted roads. Normal road trains can't exceed 53.5 metres without carrying permits. They still must carry their oversize or over length signs on them, but they don't need to carry permits if they stay within those certain lengths. Okay, so that's part of the dimension. So again, not rocket science. There's your measurements there. The inspectors will simply measure the vehicle, and if it's outside of those, within those millimetres, they will determine whether it is a minor, substantial or a severe breach. Widths of vehicles cannot go over 2.5 metres, so that's covering the tray, the vehicle body itself. The load and the vehicle tray can't have anything protruding beyond 2.5 metres. We can't include mirrors, we can't include mud guards or any indicator or safety device lights or any ABS line systems or valve systems in the tyres, because they're actually safety devices. But the actual load and tray itself cannot go over 2.5. So you can see again, they will work on these measurements here to determine whether you are a minor, substantial or severe. It's not hard. They get out a tape measure or they get a laser pointer out and they measure. Projection limits, so it depends on the configuration of the vehicle, but as a general rule of thumb, there's a usual 1.2 metre overhang allowability. But remember, you've got to allow for the fact that on a heavy rigid truck, regardless of whether you're a metre overhanging at the rear of the vehicle, if your entire load and vehicle is over 12.5, you are in breach, okay? And that's why they're looking at these percentages or distances there. If you are projecting loads beyond their normal vehicle body, you need to affix a red flag, and under the regulations at night time you must have a red light that can be seen at least 200 metres in the distance, so on that actual load, on that flag. So it's very important people check their regulations when it comes to any oversized loads of any kind. The heights of vehicles, there's the distances there in which they measure beyond, and the maximum measurement can't exceed 4.3 metres. Unless you're driving a livestock trailer or unless you're driving a double car carrier, they are allowed to go to 4.6 metres in WA under the regulations, but they can't go down a lot of roads that normal heavy vehicles can go due to the heights of bridges, etc. So they are gazetted to certain roads. They have certain routes that they must follow. Some of the images from the regulations, so you can see there that the height from road to top can't exceed more than 4.3, that the width, not talking mirrors, etc., can't exceed more than 2.5. You can see the length there, including load of a heavy rigid, not exceeding 12.5. The length of the semi-trailer, including load, not exceeding 19. And that's where I was saying you've got that approximate 1.2 metre overhang there. When they do this on a heavy rigid, it's a little bit harder. They do allow a 1.2 at the front, but when they're looking at the rearward overhang, it's measured from the in between the axle grouping here, the tandem axle and back, and they have to determine, or you have to determine, either a maximum of 3.7 metres or no more than 60% of the wheelbase, whichever's lesser. That's your wheelbase there. So that's what you've got to work back from. So it is a bit of a calculation process, and if unsure, it's always best, like with anything, to check and find out, because you don't want to go out there assuming that you're okay, and then you find you actually are over length, or you have a projection limit that is exceeding the regulation. Now we look at the third element of this. We've talked about mass dimension. Now we're looking at load restraint breaches, and the same categorisation of breaches: minor, substantial, severe. The minor breaches are saying the load has not become displaced or unsecured. The load becoming displaced or unsecured is not imminent, and no serious risk to harm of public safety, the environment or road infrastructure. So people would then say to me, well, what's wrong? If it's not coming free, if it's not going to hurt anybody, what harm is there? There's that line in the sand. It's saying the same as saying, what's wrong with doing 65 in a 60 zone? You run the risk of a further braking and stopping distance and reaction time the faster you go. So we have to have a line in the sand and a black and white policy. And what tends to be the cause of this type of breach is that maybe the operator has not placed an appropriate amount of restraint on. So they haven't referred to the load restraint guide correctly, or they may not have been trained correctly. And what happens is they assume, and that's the worst thing you can do in industry, and they think, well, one 50mm web strap over my load should hold that load down. It may very well do, but under severe braking conditions or cornering if needed to evade a disaster, it may not be enough. So therefore what happens is the inspector will look at that load restraint device and work out, is it within 10% of wear? Because if it is, that's a breach. Is it adequate restraint for that type of load? Has it been appropriately applied to that type of load? And have they put enough on? It may even push into the substantial area. The load has become displaced or unsecured, or it may not have become displaced or unsecured, but there's a likelihood that this could occur. There's still no mention here, though, in substantial, of a person being injured or harmed. We see that in the severe category. The load has become displaced or unsecured, or is becoming displaced or unsecured, and there's a serious risk of harm to public safety. It bemuses me in 2022 that there are still transport operators out there, and I will not mention names, but there are transport operators out there that still allow their drivers to leave their yard with closed curtains and not one load restraint device on that load or loads. There's this misconception in the industry that rated curtains are the be-all end-all. They're not. You need to read the data plate or the affixed notice plate on the curtain to understand what the rating of that curtain is. For those of you that are not familiar with transport, you have generally what is known as a headboard of a truck, which is at the front of the truck. You will have a tail-type board on a truck. If the loads are all perfectly placed in and blocked from front to back, and it cannot go forward, it cannot go backward, but it has the potential to go sideways, then yes, there's an argument that as long as your rated curtains have the rating per pallet space, mind you, to actually withstand the sideways movement, then you may be okay. But we're talking people that are going out there, putting 3 or 4 loads on a truck, putting some gates up, closing their curtains and just driving up the road. And the often annoying attitude I hear is, well, I'm just going up the road. Okay folks, so now that we've looked at the breaches for load restraint in the chain of responsibility, we do need to consider the methods to ensure that loads are secured. So currently the load restraint guide that we govern by in WA is 2004. Frustrating because the person that wrote the legislation actually wrote all loads must be secured in accordance with the Load Restraint Guide 2004. By putting a year on the end of that, it really does corner for any change. The guide that was released in 2018 is used in every other state and territory of Australia except the WA. Now the inspectors will still go by the 04 guide. If you look through the 04 guide, it's a good guide, don't get me wrong, but when you get to the tables at the back, which is the amount of restraint required based on the type of device being used, it limits it to a 50mm web strap. It offers two forms of friction, high and medium, and it offers a 8mm transport chain, friction, high and medium, but the actual binder for the chain is not the turnbuckle that is the industry recognised buckle, but the over-centre binder. The over-centre binder is not illegal, but most companies now won't accept an over-centre binder on their sites due to the cheater bars and other things being used on those devices. For dangerous goods, you must use the 18 guide because it's a national licence, so therefore you are required to restrain all dangerous goods in accordance with the 2018 Load Restraint Guide. The performance-based standards, this is the law side of it here, that you are to restrain all loads up to 80% of their weight forward for hard braking, of course. The sideways and rearward movement, you are required to restrain 50% of the weight of that load. And for up and down movement, it's 20%. Now, the good engineers that write these guides, that work for the National Transport Commission, they've done the maths for us. We don't have to calculate it. All of the tables at the back of the guide, whether the load is blocked or unblocked, have been calculated based on the 80% or the 50%. So that's already been done for us, which is fantastic. There's an old saying, you can't get in trouble for over-restraining, but you certainly can get in trouble for under-restraining. So you can't go wrong using the new guide because it far supersedes the old 2004 guide. The enforcement breaches and the powers, the agencies that do this, of course, are the transport inspectors. Their powers are much greater now because they have a line in that sand, the direct COR legislation that they can work to. They do wear body cam now, so they are recording what's going on the side of the road. There is discussion from Main Roads that they are going to a tablet system when they're doing the infringement notices and so forth. And part of that is for legibility. And also when inspectors are working out the weather and it's raining, it can get quite destroyed by the water. And also I think when they're actually when they do that infringement and save it, it uploads automatically, so it can't be lost. So that's actually an advance in technology. There are dedicated investigators, an intelligence unit. They obviously look into more serious type cases. They can investigate reports from general public that a load fell off a vehicle. This was the registration number. They can look at camera footage and work out if that was actually the case, and they can go and actually inspect premises and ask for information and evidence. Of course, the WA Police, they enforce chain of responsibility as well. No different to when they enforce speeding or road traffic rules, etc. Chain of responsibility falls under those regulations. So an investigation, prosecution will happen without a doubt when there's a fatality. And we don't want to hear about fatalities, it's not a nice thing. You've got to think you are leaving, or people are leaving their family behind. It causes a chain of heartbreak for so many people. They also will look at it if there's been a complaint and informant type system. So if there's been an informant that's given information or evidence about a particular breach or case, the intelligence gathered would be used in court to ensure that what they are trying to charge that responsible person for is accurate, not just hearsay. We can't work on hearsay in law. It has to be factual. On the Main Roads website, you can actually go on there and download the fact sheets, which I'll talk about shortly. They also have the prosecutions for the last 5 or so years, so this is 2021. You can see there that A driver there on the 7th of January 21 was fined $5,000 for overloading a triaxle group. You can see there on the 22nd of the 1st 2021, a responsible person was fined $10,000 for overloading a single drive. So you can see there's dimensional breaches there. There's a breach for being off route, so they weren't following the permit requirements that were set out for them. Most of these I can see here are dimensional and weight breaches, but there are of course other pages to this when you look on the website. They're free to the general public, it's public knowledge. So have a look at that, and it sort of gives you an idea of the penalties that are being enforced in Western Australia. So what do you have to do? Well, quite simply, from all the conversation I've had with you today, whichever activity you perform in the chain, it's making sure that you take all of those reasonable steps to manage that risk. It's all about risk management. This whole process is risk management. Doing nothing is not an option. It's as simple as that. It's your responsibility to minimise the risk. So minimising risk means putting a risk assessment approach in, and what you're doing there is you're actually mitigating what the level of risk is by bringing it down as far as practicable to make that task safe. In court, you can defend and have reasonable steps of defence if you can provide evidence that you did not know of the breach, or you could not have been reasonably expected to know of the breach, or that you took all reasonable steps at the time to prevent that breach. So an example would be if your vehicle has been loaded in the yard, you've gone through the load plan and it's been signed off as correct and accurate, you've taken photos of your loads, you've had the vehicle go over the weigh bridge and it's printed the weigh docket, and that vehicle's left absolutely dots on your I's and your T's crossed, and you know everything was hunky-dory, then you could prove that in court you did everything practicable. If the driver, on the other hand, has made a change during that journey without your knowledge, well then you could not be reasonably expected to have known that has occurred. So that could be a reasonable step of defence example. When we talk about managing reasonable steps, you must regularly identify and assess what the risks are. So there's nothing we do in work in industry now that is not risk assessed, let's be real. Whether it's a simple Take 5 or a JHA or a JSA, whether we go down the realms of a safe work method statement, we need to have these risk assessment approaches put in a logical order and have standard operating procedures and safe work instructions and procedures given to operators so that when they do these tasks, they are doing it to their safest and best ability. You can manage risk by doing all you can to eliminate the risk if practicable. If you can try and get rid of it altogether, get rid of it altogether. If you can't, then do everything you can to reduce or minimise the risk as much as practicable. Okay? And again, that's old saying, doing nothing is not an option. So what is deemed reasonable? So when the inspectors look at, or there's an investigation into a COR possible breach, they're looking at the nature of the transport task. Was it a heavy haulage task that was being done? Was it a dangerous goods load that was being moved? Was it a simple 5 pallets on the back of a medium rigid truck going 2 kilometres up the road? What was the task that was being done? What type of level of expertise, training and experience of the operators and responsible persons that were doing this task? Was there a risk management approach that actually encompassed the policies and the procedures to ensure that, as I said previously, you dot all your I's, you cross all your T's, you are then able to have those steps of defence to say, listen, I have taken all reasonable steps, here's my documented evidence, here's my photographic evidence, you've done everything in your power. And don't forget the term reasonably practical does mean at that time it was done as reasonably practical to the best ability of training and expertise, equipment, etc. The monitoring and auditing procedures is like any risk assessment. Don't do one risk assessment and shelve it for 10 years. You need to review and monitor your risk assessments and your policies and procedures on a very regular basis. Things change, weather changes, drivers change, vehicles change, trailers can change, situations can change, roads can change. You need to be prepared to monitor and review and audit those procedures to make sure they're still valid. So reasonable steps could include, as we've pretty much said, reviewing the business processes and practices that you have in place, and also looking at the commercial arrangements that you have. If you've got an arrangement that is not meeting the criteria, for example, the person you're using is not following the law or not using the appropriate vehicle for the goods that you are asking them to move, then you need to look at changing those arrangements. You have the right to do that if it's non-compliant. Because one thing that the chain of responsibility law does look at is you cannot reward or bad behaviour. You can't reward non-compliance. And if you allow or put the blinkers on and ignore knowingly that that is being done incorrectly, you are just as liable under the chain of responsibility. Adopt a risk management approach, which I've talked about on a multitude of occasions today. Have the appropriate training and supervision. Make sure that people that are doing the task, as I said, are all avoiding reward for non-reward. Don't reward someone for bad behaviour. Simple as that. And look at some checklists. I mean, checklists are used in pre-starts, they're used in checklists for dangerous goods, they're used in all sorts of different ways. You can have a checklist for loading and unloading, you can have a checklist on your load plan, you can have a checklist for dangerous goods. There's no limit again to what you can do to make this the best possible outcome for your business. So on reflection of everything I've talked about today, questions for you to consider would be, have you taken all reasonable steps to comply with COR legislation? And after this session, you may be sitting back thinking, well, you know what, maybe we could improve our business practices a little more. Maybe we could invest a little bit more in our training and supervision. So have you got the right vehicles that are doing the task for you? Have you got the right contractors that you are using to do the task for you? So you need to look at these things and really ask yourself, because long term, indemnity is a prevention method, and the best form of indemnity is to have the right training and procedures in place in order for you to sort of minimise those risks and also avoid breaches and penalties. I did mention to you when looking at the main roads breach sort of sheet that I showed you, that you can go onto their website, type in chain of responsibility in the search engine, and you will be able to download the 10 fact sheets that are available to everyone in Western Australia. The fact sheets are designed to cover compliance and enforcement right through the light vehicle, and they give some very clear, easy to read instructions of what is required or what is the responsibility of each party, for example, and what examples or steps could be taken to prevent a breach. So what sort of systems could be used, etc. As far as Nationwide goes, we do pride ourselves on the longevity of being a training corporation that has offered training in dangerous goods and transport and so on for many, many years. We are one of the oldest registered training organisations in Western Australia, and we also have a bookstore which we do provide for the industry. We have the Load Restraint Guide, we have hard copies of either the original HB 76 or the new Emergency Response Guide that is written by the National Transport Commission. We also have the Dangerous Goods Code and Segregation Wheel, other resources available to you. You can go into websites such as Main Roads, the Department of Mining and Industry Regulation and Safety to get further updates. Subscribe to these as well, so you're getting these regular updates if there's any changes to legislation, safety alerts that might have occurred, and so on and so on. We also offer, in addition to our traineeships and other courses we do, you've got to be thinking outside the box here. If you're expecting someone to load a vehicle, by law since 2007, you have to hold a high-risk work licence to have a forklift licence. It's not a ticket, it is a licence. So if you've got people that are operating forklifts unsupervised without a licence, especially under the new work health safety legislation, please cease that activity immediately, or you will be fined heavily by WorkSafe if they come on site. Okay, we do dangerous goods licensing, explosive licensing, and we cover storage and handling, which is a completely separate element to dangerous goods. We do also cover manual handling, load restraint, and we do detailed chain responsibility as well, as amongst other things. So go onto our website or give us a call, have a look and see what we offer. I'd like to thank you today, and I hope that the information I've provided you today is a sort of an insight and a starting point in getting the cogs turning a little bit in the brain to ensure that what you are doing is correct, and if you have any doubts on that, then looking a bit deeper to what you can do to make that difference. So thank you very much for your time today, folks, and I wish you all a great weekend. Okay, all the best.